The right to vote is something that is essential for a functioning democracy. However, during a major disruption, such as a war, this can prove to be very difficult to achieve. In Australia, there were in fact two federal elections held during the Second World War, one in 1940 and another in 1943, which is what we will be talking about today. There were calls at the time to suspend or postpone these elections. Some people argued that given the wartime circumstances, and in the case of 1943 the direct threat to Australia, resources and public attention would be best directed elsewhere. However, these were overruled, as the Australian Constitution is actually quite specific about how often elections must be held, with no exceptions. The first one in 1940 was a relatively straightforward affair. As Australia was not directly threatened yet, there were relatively few constraints at home to running the election. In addition, not too many military personnel had yet been sent overseas. The 1943 election, though, was an entirely different story. By this time, Japan had entered the war against the Allies, and fighting was raging on Australia's doorstep. This left the Department of Home Affairs, then responsible for conducting elections, with unique and difficult challenges. Not only did they have to find the resources to run a full election under wartime conditions, but they also had to get the over 800,000 military personnel stationed overseas to cast their ballot. To make things even harder, compulsory voting was now in place. There was previously a federal election held in wartime during the First World War in 1917, but at this point the law had not yet changed to require eligible citizens to vote. This was done in 1924. And so the department had to press on with organising probably the most difficult election in Australia's history. The 1943 campaign was nicknamed the Khaki Election, and for good reason. Given the high number of people in uniform at the time, they would hold significant sway over the final result. Some soldiers even stood for election themselves. Special leave was created by the Commonwealth Government to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to exercise their democratic right to stand as a candidate. However, this leave would not be paid, and they would also not be permitted to participate in any political activities while in uniform, presumably for the military to avoid any perceptions of political bias. A key part of the opposition United Australia Party's policy platform at the time was also focused on improving conditions for soldiers, so many of these military candidates were endorsed by the party. However, several also stood for other parties, or as independents. One of these independents was Sergeant Michael Katzoff. He was born in Russia in 1908 and spent time in Italy during the fascist takeover of the country. He migrated to Australia as a result and later joined the Australian Imperial Force, or AIF, in 1940, serving with the 9th Division in the Middle East. He was so determined to stand for Parliament that he hitchhiked over 1,200 kilometres before boarding a plane to Brisbane and then by train to Sydney in order to submit his nomination papers. He was ultimately unsuccessful in his candidacy, but later became a noted expert in forestry and ecology, also being elected as an alderman and mayor for Ku-ring-gai City Council, and finally being awarded an Order of Australia medal for his work. Anyway, the way in which this election worked was quite different to peacetime. For one thing, soldiers were permitted to vote ahead of the official polling day. This was to account for several things, including time zone differences and the operational needs of the military. Other issues included how to record the votes of small and isolated units, plus those of the sick and injured. And so, several solutions to all of these problems were devised. Officers of all branches of the armed forces were appointed as temporary returning officers to organise and collect ballots, as well as ensure the integrity of the voting process. They travelled for weeks across the world on all types of vehicles, from aeroplanes, camels, canoes to donkeys, giving servicemen and women of all ranks and service the chance to vote. The process to vote, though, was very different to peacetime if you were someone stationed overseas or elsewhere in Australia. One of the returning officers would come to your unit or location in the weeks leading up to polling day, wherever you were or whatever you were doing. You would then have to show your military identification and paybook in order to receive your ballot. The returning officer or one of their staff would then either hand you a regular printed ballot or, as in many cases, have to manually write in the candidates' names for your electorate before handing it to you to cast your vote. All of the ballots would then be collected and taken to a central point for counting. After polling day, it took much longer for votes to be collected and tallied than usual. Owing to obvious delays caused by the war, full results were not fully confirmed until many weeks afterwards. And while ballots for the House of Representatives were counted overseas and the results simply cabled, Senate ballots had to be physically transported by air back to Australia in order for the complex system of preferences to be distributed. And to allay security fears, no information was published on where military votes had been cast, so as not to give information on unit positions to the enemy. Over 4.5 million people voted with historic results. It was the first time in Australian history that the Labor Party held a majority in both houses of Parliament, and it remains the largest electoral victory by the Labor Party to this day. It also resulted in the first women being elected to Parliament, with Enid Lyons becoming the member for Darwin and Dorothy Tangney elected to the Senate representing Western Australia. John Curtin was re-elected as Prime Minister and served until his death in 1945. The 1943 Australian federal election was conducted extremely well under incredibly challenging circumstances. Every Australian, regardless of where they were given the opportunity to participate in the democratic process. Given the huge barriers to achieving this, it's quite remarkable that this was able to be achieved at all. I hope you enjoyed this video on Australia's Khaki Election of the Second World War. Please subscribe if you would like to stay up to date on future videos, and feel free to click the like button as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.